I'll try it again. Good morning. I'm Jason Witt. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Faith and Learning. And on behalf of my colleagues, let me say again how delighted we are to have you here. This has been a wonderful first 2 days, and we're so excited about the final day today. We want to let you know one other thing that hasn't been perhaps as seen as much, but this evening at 5:15 between one of our last sessions, our evening dinner and plenary, we'll have a Vespers service, and we'd be so delighted for you to be a part of that. It'll be about 30 minutes of prayer, singing, a brief homily, worship together as part of our conclusion for this conference. We'd be so pleased for you to be with us. Our hope each time we plan this conference, as we think about the Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture, our desire is that this conference will be, for all of you who participate, a time of reflection, of rich conversation, of deep consideration within the Christian tradition on the life of the mind, the life of faith, how those intersect on these most important issues. And so for us to have you here as part of this, we hope it's something you will take away from, move from here back to your campuses, enriched, encouraged, inspired, and continually thinking more on these issues. And so with this aim in view, it is certainly now my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Celia Deane-Drummond. Dr. Deane-Drummond is currently professor in theology at the University of Notre Dame, where she holds a unique appointment concurrent between the Department of Theology in the College of Arts and Letters and the College of Science. Additionally, she is a fellow of the X Institute for Global Health at Notre Dame. Now, some of you might have received some of our earlier promotional material, call for papers, and you'll think, now that's not where we had her listed. It's because she's just taken up this post this fall at Notre Dame. Prior to that, she was at the University of Chester. I am certain our friends at Notre Dame are most pleased with her move. Professor Celia Deane-Drummond is one of those wonderfully gifted and broadly interested scholars whose expertise bridges the chasm too often imposed in higher education between the sciences and the humanities, or more specifically, between the sciences and theology. She graduated in natural sciences from Cambridge University and obtained a doctorate in plant physiology at Reading University prior to postdoctoral fellowships at the University of British Columbia and at Durham University. She subsequently took up a lectureship in plant physiology at Durham University before turning her attention more fully to theological studies, obtaining an honors degree in theology and then her doctorate from Manchester University. To say someone is a sought-after speaker and is spoken internationally would be high praise in any discipline. To acknowledge this of a scholar in two different disciplines is rare indeed. Professor Deane-Drummond has spoken as a scientist, as a theologian, and most importantly as one who understands the intersection and importance of interplay between the two. She has lectured widely in all areas relating to theology and theological ethics, particularly the biosciences with ecology and genetics. She has produced numerous articles, books, edited collections, and essays focusing on the engagement of systematic theology and the biological sciences, alongside practical ethical discussion in bioethics and environmental ethics. We've even used a wonderful essay she has on wisdom remembered, its place in the academy, here with some of our faculty reading groups to wonderful response. From 2000 to 2011, she held a professorial chair in theology and the biological sciences at the University of Chester and was director of the Center for Religion and the Biosciences. In May of this year, she was elected chair of the European Forum for the Study of Religion and Environment. She served as editor of the international journal Ecotheology for 6 years, and from July 2009 to July 2010, she was seconded to the spirituality team at the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development, working explicitly in the area of environmental justice and climate change. This morning, Professor Deane-Drummond will speak on Wisdom Remembered, the Place of Theological Wisdom in the Academy. Will you please join me in welcoming Professor Celia Deane-Drummond.
I'm deeply grateful for that introduction and also for the invitation to speak at this symposium. And it's a great honor for me to be here amongst such prestigious speakers and and researchers and others who are here for us to join together in what I would call a common search for wisdom. My lecture today draws on around 17 years of experience that I had working at the University of Chester, which was founded in 1839 by the Church of England, specifically to train teachers in order for those teachers to go out and educate the very poor people, specifically in the northwest of England. Gradually, the brief of the University of Chester, or Chester College as it was then, expanded beyond teacher training to include other subject disciplines. And in the time I was there, the university grew from about 5,000 students to 10,000 students. It doubled in size. It moved from being a college dedicated to training teachers to one that it enlarged into other subject disciplines as well. And it also, in the Theology and Religious Studies department where I was working myself, moved from having one doctoral student to 65 doctoral students. So it was, but its heartland of being a teaching institution still remained. And that's also true in the University of Notre Dame where I now work. The primary purpose or the mission of the university is teaching excellence, not research, even though research is also very high on the agenda as a way of informing that teaching. And I say that in the light of of what we heard last night about the ethos or the dominant ethos of the universities that was portrayed as being one of research. I think that's not necessarily true. Certainly it's not true of the two institutions that I've been part of. I'm also speaking out of my experience of working in the United Kingdom because I haven't been in the United States long enough to really speak with any authenticity. And as a culture, the United Kingdom is secular rather than dominantly Christian. It's not as secular as places like the Netherlands or maybe France, but it's still highly secular. But at the same time, because of its history, there are theology and religious studies departments in government-supported universities. But the existence of those theology and religious studies departments has also been questioned and interrogated by other subject domains and other professors as how far they are valid as academic pursuits because of the very secularity of the culture in which it's in. And I'm going to give you one example from some work that I did with social scientists at the University of Lancaster as a way of illustrating this particular point. Now, how far this would also apply to the US, I'm uncertain, but maybe you can meditate in your own context as well as anything like this might apply. Certainly it impinges, as I say, on this area of social science. And the particular work I'm going to refer to is work that I conducted in the 1990s with social scientists at the University of Lancaster who were interested in the motivation of public opinion about genetically modified organisms. Now, GMOs, and specifically on food crops, the controversies over GMOs, and especially in their relation to food, has not really taken off in the US as much as in Europe. But in Europe and in Britain in particular, this was an area of heated public debate and discussion. Now, the Lancaster University group conducted this research, and they found and published in a report called Uncertain World the evidence or the reasons why they supposed people were objecting to genetically modified organisms. In that report, there was no reference at all to religion or religious issues. When I discussed this with a colleague there, Bron Szynski, who had more sensitivity to religious issues and was himself trained as a theologian to some extent, he agreed that this was very odd. So we decided to look at the original transcripts again. And when we did that, we found, to our surprise, or it wasn't really a surprise, but there was evidence of implicit religious themes peppered throughout the transcripts, and these had been summarily ignored by those who were interpreting the original data. Now, it's not that they were deliberately excluding religion in writing this report, it's just the question hadn't even occurred to them to ask. And I think this says something interesting. Eventually, we published our results in Studies in Christian Ethics, and it was under the title of Genetically Modified Theology, slightly facetious. But it eventually went into a book called Reordering Nature that talked about the whole issue of how we reorder our natural world in relation to technology. And a number of other theologians and ethicists contributed to that debate and discussion. But that's not really why I want to tell you this story today, to advertise that particular volume. What I want to do is to look more broadly about what this shows about the place of religion and religious studies in the academy, that is, in the UK academy. First of all, religion as a topic was marginal to the thinking of many serious academics. And secondly, the forgetting of the place of theology in the academy is something that was almost unnoticed, or, if you like, pushed to one side. In religious studies, and in Lancaster University in particular, the tendency was to ape the methods of science in order to gain credibility and win respectability. And as we heard yesterday through that marvellous talk with Walter Brueggemann, perhaps we can even say that it joins in the chorus of the most powerful. Of course, there's a backlash amongst the humanities with the postmodern discourse. But I would say that postmodernity is a mirror image of the modernity instead of a recovery of wisdom. In other words, there's just a reaction and a counter-reaction, and it's not really seeking after wisdom. But more serious than this, theology in itself has become, or it certainly is portrayed, as a Cinderella subject, a laughing stock even. And those of you who've read David Lodge's novels about the University of Rummage might know or may not realise that he's actually basing his account on the University of Birmingham, where he worked. As a scientist and as a practicing scientist in the 1980s working at Durham University, the questions and the theological and the philosophical questions that I wanted to ask around the area of biotechnology also caused some derision amongst my fellow colleagues, even though they had a fair amount of respect for the publications I wrote in the science itself. So what I'm saying is it impinges not just at an institutional level, it also impinges at a personal level in my own life history as well. Theology seems to have come a long way from its role as queen of the sciences in the 13th century. Even in the UK, I would say that the memory of religious experience, however, is latent. In other words, there's something that's going on there that cannot be forgotten. The attempt to suppress wisdom is perhaps part of the captivity to the Enlightenment agenda and the utilitarian model of education that seems to be dominating the discussion. Other ideologies such as fascism, communism, or scientific naturalism and capitalism all tend to exclude theology as a serious conversation partner. Other voices such as Marx, Feuerbach, and Nietzsche and Freud are ones which David Ford mentions in his account of what's happening to theology and religious studies in the university. To some extent, it's understandable why some of these critical voices have emerged. It was partly as a result of a struggle for liberation from the stranglehold of ecclesial authority in earlier times. But at the same point, at this point, I'd like to say that one captivity has now been replaced by another captivity. So we're not necessarily gaining anything. What should theology be like? Should it capitulate to the academic agenda of secular partners? Students now are asked to make sense of Scripture, not Scripture make sense of them. Or rather, as we heard at the beginning of this conference, removed from any scriptural consideration whatsoever. Theology has become domesticated, secularized, and prized apart from practice. Skills become transferable, and religious studies, supposedly an entirely neutral standpoint, is praised in terms of its objectivity. Is the idea even of a Christian university a perversion of the true university in its universal embrace for free thought? But this latter idea assumes that tradition is inimical to free inquiry, and that's what I would like to challenge today. And the way I'm going to challenge that is by looking at John Henry Newman's vision for higher education. First of all, John Henry Newman found seeds of this squeezing out of religious traditions back in the 19th century. He wrote around 1852 and 1858 his idea of the university, which was more or less the same time as Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, just a few years later. Newman was challenged by the rise of individualism as he saw then. And of course, this is, in a sense, he was prophetic in noticing some of these characteristics of his society. He also argued that epistemic narrowness had replaced broader thinking, and advances in science in the public domain were aping scientific epistemology in the whole university sector. So those advances in science, because they were, if you like, accepted in public, then started to impinge on the way the university sector was shaped. Newman believed that there was some worth in science as an intellectual discipline. So I'm not trying to suggest that science should be squeezed out either. In other words, we shouldn't just necessarily revert to being in liberal arts colleges alone. But what he did say, but it needs, as it were, to be recognized for the worth it gives and not beyond its own worth. Newman argued that scientific knowledge was worthy as a form of intellectual training, and he called this notional apprehension. This notional apprehension he described as deductive, scientific, and logically conclusive. But he also pointed to something called real apprehension through weak evidences, and this is much harder to get our thoughts around if we're in the scientific culture. Here, notions, images, and historical occurrences and emotions all play a part in shaping how we know. In his elative sense, knowledge is learnt through practice. And here I'm going to quote something from his idea of a university. I can find it. The elative sense constructs knowledge through practice so that there is a going round an object by the comparison, the combination, the mutual correction, the continual adaptation of many partial notions, by the employment, concentration, and joint action of many faculties and exercises of the mind. So for real apprehension, there needs to be a greater sensitivity to the complexity of truth. So that of the type of learning, perhaps, that we heard in Professor Vogler's MA program. The reason that program was so successful is because it refused to simplify knowledge or fragment it. And for Newman, an oversimplification is a failure in imagination. Ideology was very close to heresy, and that is a failure to see tensions. But the ideology that's now dominating the university sector takes the shape of the wealth, wisdom, might that we heard in Walter Brueggemann's account. It's a controlling mindset. And it's one that was noticed by Nicholas Lash, who was professor of philosophical theology at the University of Cambridge until quite recently, when he talks about the danger of univocal thinking, shutting out the imagination. I would agree with Nash to some extent, although I don't think the sciences necessarily have to have this kind of univocal thinking. Theology can also be captive to this univocal thinking. What's necessary is to try and free ourselves up from thinking, as it were, along one mindset and not allowing room and openness to the discussion of other concepts in the way that Newman was suggesting. Also, I would suggest that proper training of the mind, as Newman, can include science. And at the highest level, science is also imaginative and intuitive. So they're closer together, as it were, than they appear. The problem is that what you might call low-level science, that is, science that's not imaginative, has somehow seeped its way into the way the universities are shaped. And it's this, I think, we need to correct. And I think scientists would probably agree as well. So there's a difference between acquiring information and education. Mary Midgley's book, Wisdom, Information and Wonder, was very alert to the problems in specialized knowledge and the fragmentation that we find ourselves in today. And I would say that this fragmentation is true not just of the sciences, it's also true of the humanities and true of theology as well. So we can't sort of pitch one subject domain against the other and say, oh, well, theology's got it right. Well, I'm not sure that it necessarily has, because it's all part of the same process. For Newman, education at its highest must also be concerned with divine reality. And that, if you like, allows us to see that there's so much more to know and so much more that we do not know. And as informed by practice, it needs to be in service to the public good. For Newman, an authentic university is therefore Christian, because the knowledge of God is necessary for complete learning. And this is very different from the utilitarian calculus, where knowledge has to be directly useful. In other words, we have to link up with practice and practices, but it doesn't mean to say that the only knowledge that's worth having is always practical. Another problem that we can identify in relation to this discussion is the idea of knowledge as construction, which began to dominate over pure contemplation. And the constructive base in itself is what you might call monocular, that is, rather like the univocal idea that Nicholas Lash has suggested. The task of the university then for Newman becomes one of complicating learning, one that goes beyond simply information or technique. He resisted, however, some sort of superficial knowledge over the range of disciplines, so it's not enough just to bring the disciplines together in multidisciplinary tasks in a superficial way. Instead, we need intellectual rigor and power to discriminate and assess the real value of things. Universities for Newman need to become seats of wisdom, encouraging a multidisciplinary approach and new insights within a community of learning. So it's not enough for people to work away on their own in isolation. And I would say that here, science has more wisdom than the humanities, because scientists know that knowledge is enlarged, as it were, through communities and not just in isolation, in a way that I found to my shock when I moved from being a science scholar to being a humanities scholar. But I think that the scientists need to take more time to contemplate and reflect on the significance and the insights of what they're doing, and also some of their presuppositions, whereas theologians and those in the humanities need to think more about working together in a collaborative manner. So multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary topics such as where two areas come together, as in biophysics or biochemistry, are very creative ways of going about things. Now the new faculties new faculty is assembled around problems rather than necessarily subject domains. And I think it's this kind of approach to higher education that Newman would have been very supportive of. Issues in globalization have forced us to move away from our narrow subject domains, and it forces a multidisciplinary perspective. Areas such as sustainability, global health or peace studies are just too complicated for one particular subject area to say that they have the answers in this respect. And I think that the numerous institutes and centres in the University of Notre Dame, where I now work, is sort of evidence, at least in one university, of where this focus has taken us. And I think that it's much slower as a method of education in the UK. You don't get quite so many multidisciplinary approaches. You do get combined honours courses, but students are not actively encouraged to link their two disparate subject domains. I had courses in students in Chester who took psychology, for example, and theology, but they were kept in watertight compartments. Unless they did a specific course on science and religion, they didn't really start thinking about how to integrate them. Newman also recognised that some universities needed to be specialists, but not all universities could teach everything. But universality of the university means that subjects should not be excluded in principle. And that's part of the problem that I see in the UK, at least, of trying to squeeze out theology from the agenda. Newman also understood education as not simply being passive reception, but also a way of life. And I'm going to give you one more quote from him in this respect. He says that universities inspire learners not to knowledge as a goal, but to the wisdom that a life of learning instills. So it's a life of learning. And one of the things which Chester was good at was widening participation to those who are at different stages of their life who may not have had the opportunities to become educated earlier on. So the university was an open university, and one of my oldest doctoral students was in her late 70s, although she was doing she used to be an anthropologist, although eventually she decided to discontinue, but that's not really the point. In other words, age was not a barrier to learning. Knowledge ceases to be knowledge if it's particularized or isolated from broader patterns of thought or inquiry, fostered in the community of teachers and scholars and students. And the tendency for this fragmentation as a way of attracting an expert, I think, is also true in the way that the United Kingdom has set up its research assessment exercise, which deliberately gives credit for what's called world-class research, but what that really means is research that no one else is doing. So it's not helped to correct this by the most recent research exercise, which tries to measure the practical input of subject areas where this is not the intention. So you have to now, unfortunately I'm now out of this system, but if I was, I would be asked to show precisely how people who are reading my research papers and books are somehow changed as a result of reading them. Now, this is almost impossible to do, and various colleagues of mine have been thinking of creative ways of distributing seminars in public lectures and asking people to make comments on what's happened in terms of their inner psychology as a result of hearing the lecture. But this is all very bizarre, and it's not, as I said, my idea of what accounts for research excellence. Newman was much more conscious of the need to rely upon close cooperation and the collected wisdom from different subject areas. But what we find in the way that the research assessment is set up is not that sense of collectivity. So it's individual achievement alongside, as I said, an attempt to correct that by this model of application. And I'm going to talk about why we need, or why we might need, theological wisdom in particular. If God is the fount of wisdom, then what does this mean? And how can it inform the ethos of higher education? David Ford, who's a professor of theology at the University of Cambridge, believes that theology as a whole is a cry for wisdom. But I think that we might need to be a little bit more specific than that. But at the same time, we can say that theology survives in spite of these pressures, and partly because of the inner resilience of the academics doing theology, but also because many theologians see it as their vocation. It's not simply a profession. Theology can respond to modernity or postmodernity, but not capitulate to the epistemological assumptions of either. And it's this resistance that I think needs to be, theologians need to be reminded of that. Wisdom, as it's normally understood, that is, if you see it as more than simply the theology as a whole, and take it on the basis of the way the Hebrew Bible understood wisdom, wisdom in its primary base was to do with education and the family and family life and community. So in other words, it was practical and contextual before theology emerged with its and the theological elements in the wisdom tradition emerged later than the educational and the family way of finding wisdom. So it was experiential first before it became explicitly theological. And I think that the way theology emerges as contextual theology in contemporary theological debates, in reaction to abstract systematics and dogma that then has tended to dominate the theological agenda in the last century, has forgotten, as it were, that the wisdom of the Hebrew scriptures was the very practical base on which it was grounded. Now, praxis is very different from utilitarian models, but it acknowledges the need for contact with everyday problems and everyday situations. And the Hebrew Bible, the second point I want to make is that the Hebrew Bible sees wisdom as feminine, and I think that this is also significant. Christian theology has tended to be dogged by patriarchal assumptions and presuppositions, and Catherine Keller has called for emancipatory wisdom, which describes the future of wisdom in the future of theology in the university. It straddles the academic then and the ecclesial, and this, as it were, tries to offset some of the patriarchal ways that it's been understood. And I'm now going to give you a quotation from Catherine Keeler on this, and she says that at least as practiced in the indigenous and biblical traditions, wisdom is irredeemably implicated in the sensuous, the communal, the experiential, the metanoic, and the unpredictable, the imaginal, and the practical. So it's about changing hearts, but at the same time, this touches on what you might call a traditional understanding, in the way that Augustine talked about our hearts being restless till they rest in thee. So that's, as it were, the null point towards which wisdom is orientated. But it takes time to let things become the slow wisdom that we heard yesterday, as opposed to coercive control of matter by mind, which is the dominant agenda of modernity. Theological wisdom is also social. It's related to the natural world, so it's not just about the human social sphere. And I've noticed that Wendell Berry's been discussed in this conference, but I wonder whether and unfortunately I wasn't at the talks about Wendell Berry, because I think these were being given before I arrived, but for Wendell Berry, his understanding was very much one that was rooted in place. It was rooted in the wisdom of the Hebrew Bible, and that was also presupposed in the New Testament. So we can't just dispense with this tradition. While the nomadic Israelites longed for home as a land, we also see, as it were, our own restless sense of where do we belong in terms of our place. And I think that this is also relevant for the university sector. What place is it in, and how is it situated in all sorts of ways, as well as just being a human community? Perhaps one of the reasons why the Celtic Christian traditions and the wisdom, as it were, from that tradition has been so popular in the UK context is because it reminds people of their indigenous origins. I think it may be overdrawn to say that it's ecological, but at least the contact with the land was, I think, highly relevant. Wisdom is also characteristic of the way God is in relation to the natural world, and I've written about this on a number of occasions. But if we see underneath our search for wisdom the fundamental doctrine of creation, it's the way God creates, it's the way God is in relation to the world. God creates in love, but through wisdom. Then wisdom is not something that we can dispense with or marginalise. It's the way that God is with the world, so it needs to be the way we are in relation to the world, and what, as it were, the way the universities need to be in relation to who we educate and why we educate. The theological voice needs to be more than the fundamentalisms which try and assert themselves once theology is squeezed out. So I would say that although the creationism is not as popular in the UK compared with the United States, its voice is starting to be heard in that context as well. And one of the reasons it may be voiced is because once you exclude theology and theological discussion, all kinds of other fundamentalisms start to appear in its place. And yet that's the very problem or danger that many scientists fear, which is why they want to squeeze out theology in the first place. And I was shocked a few years ago in 2006 when Steve Jones, who is a sophisticated geneticist working in London, came to give a lecture at the University of Chester. And it was quite clear, first of all, he forgot which lecture he was giving, but then after he realised what it was, we found that, and there's evidence for this on the website if you want to look it up, but once he realised which lecture it was, he started talking about creationism as if it was the same as a theology of creation. And you get that kind of confusion happening amongst scientists and the way this is reported in the media and so on. That, as it were, is problematic because it means that if we exclude theology, we're excluding creationism, and the two are allied together, and it's one of the motivations why some scientists want to see theology out of the higher education sector. But, and I don't need to argue here, I'm sure, that the two are not equivalent. But once we reduce education to the utilitarian calculus, this spawns a thirst for theology that then something is missing. And so this has been mentioned a few times here, the sense that something is missing in the secular universities. But then fundamentalisms start to fill the void. We sweep the house clean and something else comes in its place. The rich theological wisdom needs to be wary then of trying to retreat into a safe haven away from the secular sphere. And I think it's very important that theology has a voice in public, both in terms of what it says in its own contexts, such as in the Christian university or in other universities, but also wider than that in the public sphere if it's going to make a difference. The New Testament is also more radical in its portrayal of wisdom. And here, wisdom is related to the paradox of suffering, not a celebration of human wisdom, but the wisdom of the cross. And I think that this doesn't do away with the wisdom of the sage, but the wisdom of the cross makes for a particular way of reading wisdom in a Christian context. But at the same time, there are other insights from the wisdom of the cross that are relevant to the secular university context as well. First of all, the image of God for the Christian is on the side of the poor, the suffering, those in pain, and those who are dying. A university, if it is to educate appropriately then, needs to be open to the special needs of others, to be pastoral. Too much trauma leads to inhibition of learning. And I found this in my own experience working at the University of Chester, where many had come from highly deprived backgrounds, and the traumas that they were in always led to a reduction in their capacity to learn. So we need to provide for that. And the wisdom of the cross also puts forward a different kind of model for higher education, one that's not so much vying for power in rhetoric terms, but also speaks of the need for humility. And if you look back at the context of the passage I'm referring to in Corinthians, it was the philosophical wisdom that was argued for here, but the counter argument was the one of the wisdom of the cross, a paradox, if you like. Is this realistic? What would management really be like if we took that wisdom of the cross seriously? How would provosts and principals of colleges operate differently? Would any secular university listen to this call or not? These are questions I think we need to ask ourselves. I want to, however, rather than going into that side, and I think it has to be contextualized in relation to the particular communities that you're in, I want to move now to think about practical wisdom, because I think that theological wisdom and practical wisdom have a relationship together, and one cannot be excluded at the expense of the other. And I'm drawing on Thomas Aquinas here, who talked about the intellectual virtues of speculative reason, understanding, as understanding science and wisdom. So those are the virtues of speculative reason. But the virtues of practical reason, of art and prudence, were important for him as well. And unlike our speaker last night, I do not think that practical reason has to be divorced from a theology, a strong theology or understanding of God as creator and so on. So we can draw on these in the way that Aquinas drew on these, but the sum of the whole summit of Aquinas' Summa Theologia was towards Christology, which was in the third part. So we can't just stop with the first part of the summa and then not read the rest. It wouldn't really be fair. But I want to say more about the final part of his summa in a minute. First of all, prudence is about deliberation, judgment, and action. How could prudence inform decisions in a university? Certainly, prudence is both individual and political. So there are political elements, and I think it's institutional elements that are particularly relevant to the way we see universities being managed. In the classic sense, prudence is also sensitive to memory. And if we think back to the history of the way wisdom has been discussed in John Henry Newman, it's clear that his approach has something to say about how we should act wisely. Alistair MacIntyre has spoken of 3 rival versions of moral inquiry, but only one, that's the Enlightenment project, informs the university. The second one, Nietzsche, which is, according to him, a deconstruction mode, it's quite difficult to even imagine how this would actually allow universities to function. In other words, it becomes impossible. So even if you go down the other version of moral inquiry, according to Nietzsche, that will not allow you to run a university. But there is a third approach, and that is one of Thomas Aquinas, which somehow forms a bridge between the two. But Aquinas goes further than MacIntyre suggests, in that he also introduces a transcendental. It's not simply an add-on, and here I align myself with Jean Porter and others. In addition to this, he admitted towards the end of his life that his monumental treatise, his Summa, was like straw, following what seems to be a mystical experience. And Joseph Piper talks about this in a beautiful book called The Silence of St. Thomas. Some have argued today that this is simply a fulfillment of his writing. In other words, his mysticism was somehow fulfilling his Summa Theologia, so he wasn't just turning away from it. But then why did he stop writing at this point? I think it's more likely that the contemplative dimension for him is crucial, and in its sense, it's sort of it should be his earlier work should be read through that lens rather than separated from it. And I don't really think that MacIntyre, for all his brilliance as a philosopher, has taken that seriously enough. Prudence, then, is not just learned, but it's also the gift of the Holy Spirit. And it presupposes faith, hope, and love. And prudence is conscious of the present, but is open to being taught. So it's essential for all learning that we're open to being taught, whatever that subject domain, including science, theology, and so on. Gavin da Costa believes that theology has become captive to the Babylonian captivity because it's aping secular agendas. Now, other disciplines scrutinize the goals of research or knowledge transfer and education, but I think that if theology has to, if you like, walk on this tightrope between being open to other disciplines and what they might have to say, but at the same time not fall in captivity to those particular agendas. And it's how, and I think that the prudence that we need in trying to design our curricula is crucial in this respect. Prudence that can also make good decisions in the face of the unexpected. And universities need to be ready to respond to crises rather than remaining silent. And it requires us to make these decisions immediately. I heard this morning how in the event of a nuclear attack, the President has 15 minutes to respond. Now, the question is, will they respond prudently or not? But that's while the threat of the nuclear activities may be not something that universities have to be conscious of today in quite the same way that they were some time ago, there are other crucial issues that I think the university needs to respond to. In other words, it has a public responsibility. So we need to go further than thinking about developing the kind of education that's going to inform the moral quality of those who are taking part. We also need to see its public face as well. Prudence also exercises caution and foresight. And these are all categories that Aquinas has used, his different parts or aspects of prudence. I'm not just making these up. Caution is aware of mistakes, being aware of mistakes, being aware that mistakes have been made in the past and we need to try harder. Has the university learned from its mistakes? I'm not quite sure whether it has or not. Or is it simply bent on accumulative strategies that look too much to the future? And again, I'm reminded of Walter Brueggemann's paper yesterday. If universities then are led by the agenda of the market, they become narrowed in vocational training, narrowed to vocational training, to specific tasks. They're no longer able to be the place when new questions emerge in relation to society. And I think this is crucial, that they need to be centres of wisdom, not just for within themselves, but also for the wider community. Aquinas believed that wisdom ultimately led to the good. That was the goal, as it were, of wisdom. But what is that good, and how should that good be shaped? It must include the public good, and for Christian, the theological good or the divine wisdom of God. At the same time, we have to decide how wide that net is going to be. How far is our global reach going to be? And in the Catholic context where I now work, the common good is a very strong Catholic tradition. And solidarity is open, as it were, to those in the global sphere as well as the provincial community. The legal structure in the UK is still influenced by a Christian context, and that legal structure is also very similar in the US compared to the UK. So you could say there's a latent Christian influence even in the most secularized subjects that we have on the academic agenda. But the university's role is more than simply producing law-abiding citizens. It also must find ways to encourage students to express and seek for ways they need to serve others and serve the wider good. And so my final section today is on practical wisdom in service to the public good. I've spent much of my time thinking about environmental issues and environmental concerns. And I believe that prudence acts as a good bridge between the secular and the Christian in this respect. I'm not going to discuss particular evidence for climate change or any of the biological accounts of biodiversity loss. I noticed that it was on the front page of the newspaper just yesterday. So it's something that's becoming more public, becoming more into the public sphere, even in the US. But I would say that sustainability lends itself to a multidisciplinary approach. But at the same time, ironically, sustainability can also be captive to the market agenda, the very agenda that seems to be dominating universities inappropriately. And I want to mention some research that was done by a colleague in the UK called John Rodwell, who is an ecologist, but he's also a priest. And he decided to look at various wildlife groups, in this case it was the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, to find out what place they had for religion. And it seems that in their account, religious belief was important, but it was only important in order to stir up desire for conservation. It couldn't be important in its own right. Now, John Rodwell argues that this is a mistake. It's a mistaken understanding of the place of religion. And in this sense, do religious practices ever allow for memory of the past? And the answer, of course, is they do not. And that's why he suggests we do need to bring in a theological view or even a historical view to remind us of the way the relationship between people and the land and the communities in that land. I'm coming now to some final conclusions. You've been very patient. First of all, I've argued that we need a religious dimension in public debate about universities. And we have been subject to a forgetting, as it were, of the importance of theology. Secondly, I've suggested that John Henry Newman, who lived at a time when knowledge was becoming much more narrow, still has something to say about the concept of a university. The Christian university shouldn't just be about permission to exist, but it needs to look to its wider impact on other universities as a whole. Above all, there need to be places where holistic learning takes place. Theological wisdom is a voice that has been marginal or even excluded in the education agenda, that is, in secular universities. But it can become, I suggest, a resource for re-envisaging the agenda for higher education. Not the only resource, but one resource. The agenda needs to be emancipatory, both practical and multifaceted. And cooperation towards the common good is a multidisciplinary task which requires mutual respect for what different disciplines have to offer. Problems emerge where any one discipline dominates, including theology. I would say that the relevance of practical wisdom for specific social and political concerns is is there in a very real and practical way in the way we think about the tasks of maybe some of our centres and institutes. A university should be a place where synthetic knowledge is encouraged, and the public are still ill-informed about the relationship between science and theological issues. So the university needs to have something to say on that as well. And yet the university is also the place where careful, rigorous and contemplative thinking can go on all at the same time. And above all, the university needs to instill a love of learning which is greater than simply success. Not just transferable skills, but citizen virtues, taking responsibility for our own lives, and beyond this, looking to what's relevant and good in the public sphere as well. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
We have a few moments for questions, and Professor Deane-Drummond has agreed to take some, so we'll open up mics here and here if you'd like to come forward and ask a question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm David DeQuattro. I teach philosophy at Grove City College. A lot of your talk focused on the external pressures within the university that are threatening to squeeze out theology. But could you talk about how academic theology would have to change from within to answer these pressures? Because it seems to me academic theology embraced this sort of Enlightenment ideal of disengaged neutrality to being disengaged from its tradition. So how would it have to change in order to resist these pressures?
Yeah, I hope I haven't been misunderstood. What I was trying to say was that there are pressures on theology to change and conform itself to the secularized agenda, but theology needs to walk on a tightrope, I would say, between being open to learning from other sciences, but also retaining a deep resonance with its traditions. So if you like, it's resourcement from within its traditions, but not in a blinkered kind of way, but in a way that's going to be of service. So I would say that theology does still survive in spite of the pressures. So I don't want to give and as I said, I was speaking out of the UK context, and David Ford has just written a book on this topic himself, where he talks about the new theology in religious studies. By new, he doesn't mean completely new. He doesn't mean ditching everything, but what he does mean is that the newness is the new situation we're in, and also the new responsiveness and the responsibility of theology, because I think theology has far more to say about the way universities might be reshaped. We heard yesterday a brilliant example of what I would call a living prophet, as it were. We saw Jeremiah reincarnated in our midst. And maybe we need theology to be a bit like that, if you like, reminding us of the need to speak out and not be silent.
Hi, I'm Ethan Schramm from the University of Virginia. And I was surprised to hear you speak about organized research units and their connection with problem solving and that having something to do with wisdom. Surprised partially with the way you tried to connect it with Newman, which I'd like to hear you elaborate a little bit more. But it seems to me that although there are a variety of types of organized research units, that the advent of this structure in the university after World War II has in large part contributed to the instrumentalization of the university. And what I mean by that is partially that these centers and institutes have been, in many times, loci for instrumental rationality that has squeezed out notions of wisdom, but also that they've been sort of social machinery that have allowed external patrons to shape what universities have done to use the university as an instrument for their own ends. So I just wondered if you could maybe clarify and elaborate on your
Okay.
views on that.
Yeah,
topic.
I was talking about ideals. I wasn't talking about the specific experience of specific research units, because I would suspect that the research units you're talking about have excluded theology and religious studies and excluded some subject domains. So I was talking about the ideal case where people would genuinely come together to collaborate and cooperate and wouldn't end up just reinforcing the very agenda which has become dominant in the university sector. So if they are doing that, they just become part of that agenda. They don't become anything creative or new. So I would say that, I haven't got the, I think it would take both a social scientist and a historian to map out exactly what the composition of these units are, but the kind of units that you're indicating exist are not the kind of units I was suggesting that Newman would be supportive of. If anything, the opposite, because they are narrow in their presuppositions and in what they're trying to achieve. But what I was trying to say was that there are certain global problems and global tasks where one particular subject domain or discipline cannot possibly answer the kind of questions that need to be addressed, but they're not fitting in with with a particular social or political agenda. They're there, as it were, in the service of the public good, and that's what I was trying to argue for. And I don't know whether you've got evidence to suggest that those particular kind of centres or units have problems associated with them as well. I mean, as I said, I haven't been in the US long enough to know whether that is the case, and I'd be interested to know whether there are problems associated with that. But it was more being resonant with Newman's idea of looking at a thing from a many-faceted, many-sided argument, and that's what I was trying to put into the equation.
I'm Paul Fortunato from the University of Houston, downtown English.
Can you speak up a bit, because I can hardly hear? I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'm Paul Fortunato from the University of Houston, downtown, in the English department. And I'm curious about the UK situation. And I wonder if you could talk about that a bit, because it could help us think about what's going on here. I teach at a state university, and we're just starting a religious studies program, and so we're stumbling trying to figure out how to do that. And in the UK, I know that, I guess historically, my understanding is these theology departments have been there at Cambridge and Oxford, but then now things have changed. It's the new situation, and some public theologians are sort of taking a more public stance, and that's very interesting to see. But then it's a multicultural society as well, and now you have Muslim professors also teaching in the theology department, and I don't know what other religions are also being represented. Can you talk about how that is affecting the theology?
Okay. I think there are two possible scenarios. One scenario, which is the scenario I'm more experienced in, is the one at the University of Chester, where theology and religious studies were combined. And it might come as a surprise to say that, how can you sit alongside people who have such very radically different methodologies? But at the same time, within that department, those coming from a Muslim perspective, for example, were often writing out of their own perspective as Muslims. So they weren't just using what I would call the religious studies model of analysis in a detached way, removed from the experiential aspects of that religion. And I think that the interaction between the insights from religious studies and theology is also useful as well. So as long as it's done in a courteous way, I don't think the two are necessarily have to be threatening to one another. The difficulty comes where religious studies says, or those in religious studies say, we have no room now for theology because it's too bigoted, or any other arguments that they could use, which of course is not true. But that's the pressure, as it were. It's claiming that their methodology is more scientific and therefore it has a better place in the university compared to theology. But of course the theology applies to those who are also committed to their faith and who are Muslims or Buddhists or whatever as well. So in a sense, I know that that's another aspect of what David Ford calls the new theology and religious studies. It's one where the two are not necessarily existing side by side, but they're in conversation together. So I think that that's one way of doing it. It's one way of but of course there is always the temptation of religious studies to over-assert itself. And this has happened in some departments in the UK where theologians have been pushed out in the way that I was indicating. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I would say that that theologians need to assert a certain resilience in this process as well, in order to not let the views of them as a minority be pushed to one side. But of course, at the same time, the kind of suffering you might say that theologians are experiencing is part of what you might call the wisdom of the cross. You know, sometimes when a group becomes itself dominant, it loses its insight, and sometimes it's actually easier to gain insight by speaking from the margins. So, because the experience you have is also one that's shared with those who are poor, for example, and so theology then has more a deeper understanding or solidarity with those who are suffering in other parts of the world, and is able to speak to that. So what I'm saying is, it's not all negative. These kind of pressures aren't simply necessarily negative pressures. I think that theology has been very creative in responses to some of these pressures, even if the number of academic posts in theology has dwindled to virtually zero.
Hi, Paul McDonald from Bucknell University. I had a question about the middle part of your talk. I was very much interested in this idea that in the relationship between theology and science, that theologians can learn from scientists in terms of their communal approach, whereas scientists can aspire towards the more imaginative heights or speculative heights that theology seeks. Thinking about this communal vision in theology, there's sort of two main obstacles that at least I can identify that it seems like scientists don't have, and maybe you could correct me on this, but I appreciate your comment on this. The one obstacle would be that the theologians don't have a shared critical methodology. And one of the things that concerns me the most is that the realist aspirations that you find in science of actually discovering the nature of things, of a mind-independent world, that kind of methodology is lacking in theology, the sort of aspiration for knowledge. So one question is, do you think that that obstacle is a chief one that theologians have to overcome? The second one, of course, that theologians face, I think, are the sectarian divides that continue to, unfortunately, plague not only theology but also Christendom. And perhaps scientists don't have that kind of sectarianism to the same degree. So any comment on that, I appreciate. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thanks for those. They're interesting questions. So the first question was more about the goal in scientific enterprise. I agree that scientists working together in a group are very goal-focused towards particular sort of target outcomes and things. But what I was referring to more was the social community in which scientists work, which, if you like, where those who leave that community are almost seen like traitors, as it were, to the cause. So in a sense, you're reinforcing what I'm saying, because that's how I felt when I left science. I had this huge burden of I've deserted the cause, and I don't think that anyone who's doing theology would have that same sense. I may be wrong, but my instinct is that the push for the discovery of truths in science is such a grip, it has such a grip on the imagination of the scientists that they have to work together to collaborate. Now, I think with theologians, what the focus for theologians would have to be, if they are going to work together collaboratively, would be around specific topics rather than specific outcomes. And therefore topics like, say, the theological place of animals, for example. I mean, we find edited collections are produced, and I must have produced half a dozen of these myself, where theologians and those from other disciplines come together to talk and collaborate and share and learn insights from one another. The difference is that the theologians then are still putting themselves in as subject, but they're sharing that view as a subject with others in order to maybe even change or modify what that subjectivity says in relation to the area. So there's an enrichment of that learning process. So I'd say that the dynamics of the collaboration and the cooperation is different, but there's still enrichment in both situations. The difficulty, of course, with the scientific collaboration is that it can foster a single mindset and may even be damaging towards being open to what other people may have to say. So there are drawbacks to the scientific community because it can end up being closed. But you get almost the same thing maybe in theological fundamentalism, where there's a closing down towards discussing and being open with others. So I'm not trying to promote fundamentalisms. What I'm trying to say is that scientists at least have the experience of working together, and so theoretically at least they should be more willing to share some of that with those in other subject domains. Now that was one question. The other question was, I'm trying to think what it was now. Oh yeah, the sectarian divides. Well, in a sense, I've answered that by talking about fundamentalisms. I think that those who are uncertain in their faith position tend to become more dogmatic and fundamentalist. And so the kind of collaboration that I'm suggesting cannot be between those who are in sectarian organizations or commitments. So unless there is some sort of openness to talking with others, even from within one's own religious denomination, or even those outside one's religious denomination, then it's not going to work. So part of this, and that's why I kept on saying in this talk, that the message I have about the need for wisdom applies as much to theology as it does to science. So we can't just say, well, we're the ones with the wisdom, you've got to learn wisdom. The wisdom has to feed into the theological agenda as well, in the way we act towards one another, in the way we're receptive to each other, in what we can learn together in community, and so on and so forth. So I would say that it applies to those of other religious traditions. I mean, it's more difficult, I think, for Muslims who have a very strong or a particular hermeneutic of the Quran, for example, to move in that direction. But I've been involved in a building bridges program with the Archbishop of Canterbury, where we talked about science and religion with those who are Muslims. There's a team of us who are from different Christian subsections, including biblical studies, systematic science and religion, and so on. And what we did together is we studied texts. So we just studied the texts of the other. So we looked at scripture, we looked at Pope John Paul II, we looked at Dawkins as an example of secular humanism or the new atheism. We looked at some of the Quran, and we shared those together, and we talked about it, and gradually a sense of, and that's going a sense of enlarging our own knowledge and understanding. So I think there are ways and means of doing that, and I think that's part of also what I mean about moving away from a sort of sectarian approach and the public responsibility of theology, because the world in which we live in is religiously very divided and bigoted. So the universities need to have a role in actually reshaping that, or promoting, as it were, greater collaboration and discussion amongst those of different religious persuasions. And one of the things I was going to say in this lecture, but there wasn't the chance, is that even though I'm coming at wisdom in this paper from a particularly Christian perspective, that's not to say that other religious traditions don't have something to say about wisdom. They do. It's just that, there's too much to do in one talk. So So I think that's probably enough.
Nathan King, philosophy, Whitworth University. To what extent do you think that rigid demarcation criteria between science and non-science are responsible for the marginalization of theology in the academy? And if the answer is to a significant extent, what advice would you provide theologians? Do they combat these demarcation criteria? Do they downplay the importance of demarcation and emphasize something else, maybe just good thinking? I wonder what your thoughts would be on those questions.
All right. I think there are two ways to address that, so thank you for that question. One is to say, let's look at some of the key problems that scientists are facing where they know that, or if they're sufficiently humble, they know they haven't got all the answers. One example might be climate change or sustainability issues. And in that context, it means that it opens the door, as it were, for collaboration with those from other perspectives, including religious perspectives. I think the Jürgen Habermas has written a book recently on modernity, in which, even from his perspective, he starts saying that there's a place for religious traditions in addressing some of the core problems that we have in our society. And one of the things that modernity fails, it fails in solidarity or building up that solidarity. So therefore, I think it's, in practical terms, it's trying to find opportunities to join in groups that are looking at those questions, and also maybe starting off with the ethical and the ethical questions. So because scientists are usually will admit now, in the way they didn't before when I was a scientist, that ethical issues are important. When I was doing science, they just ignored it. But now, now scientists are more ready to admit the importance of ethical issues, and that provides a possible opportunity for both philosophy and theology to come in. You might say, well, maybe it's, why do we need theology? Philosophy can do the job. Well, I think part of my argument today is that given the depth of religion that's felt either implicit or explicit in a community, it doesn't make sense to squeeze that out. Now, I'm not sure what you do if scientists are very resistant to that, but I'm in a privileged position of having had a background in science, so that usually means that trust is more readily engendered compared to someone who doesn't have that experience. So I think it's part of the responsibility of theologians is not only to offer their insights, as it were, to scientists in helping think about some of the difficult ethical problems, but also encouraging students, theological students, to expose themselves to the insights of science. So there's a two-way conversation going on. I know that at Notre Dame, the theology students, undergraduates, have to take one course in science, and they have to take one course in theology, and I think that's a healthy situation to be in. Now, how that pans out in other universities or your particular situation will partly depend on the politics of your institution and the particular commitments. But I think it's a start. It's about building bridges across divides. The divides that exist don't have to be there. They're humanly made. They're not fixed in all time. And I think we need to be brave enough to start trying to build those bridges up.
Hello, my name is Paul Kack, and I am a fellow in the Office of Faith Integration at Azusa Pacific University. A little-cited Wendell Berry book is called Life is a Miracle. Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah.
He takes on E.O. Wilson's consilience and talks about the reductionism of the scientific endeavor. But in there, he also illustrates his friendship with Wes Jackson, a scientist, and their cross-communication from their different perspectives. And that seems to me to get at some of the kind of collaboration you're getting at. But here's two friends, not colleagues per se, and they're not in a university. And I wonder if some of the trappings of institutional life make some of what you're suggesting difficult, while some of those outside, like these two friends concerned for sustainability and such, are able to have a special kind of dialogue and relationship.
Yeah, I'm not against what I would call informal conversations then feeding into a discussion amongst students, and I think but it's building up those relationships that's important, and maybe it's difficult because people have got entranced by their own subject domain and so don't feel brave enough to move outside. Now, Wendell Berry is unusual because he's such an expansive mind, as it were. He's very open to others from different perspectives. So even though he's critical of E.O. Wilson, he's also recognises the value of science, and I would put myself in the same sort of camp. What I don't like is scientism, that is where science overreaches itself, but I don't like theological fundamentalism either. So I think there needs to be models. I mean, we talked, one of the panels during this conference was about mentors, and I think we need mentors, not just of those who are excellent teachers, but also mentors who model interdisciplinary dialogue, so that students realize that there are in the academic world, as well as in informal conversations, the possibility for this kind of process. But how you start to sort of reshape or build up trust in a culture is something that I think will depend on the particular institution in which you're housed. But I'm confident that if people are open to the possibility of dialogue, there will be those who turn up, as it were, by divine providence, or however you might want to describe it, who are there to allow those conversations to happen. And I think that what it requires, though, is the willingness and the alertness and the paying attention to the social and the collegial situation that we're in, not just paying attention to our subject domain. And Simone Weil talked about paying attention as prayer, and I think that it needs to be thought of as part of our deeply prayerful and spiritual exercises to take responsibilities in these ways, rather than shutting off contemplation and prayer in one box and then some of these other activities in another. So I would say that it's learning to pay attention in different ways is really important.
I'm Mike Beatty, Department of Philosophy at Baylor. One of your theses is that the Christian university in particular should honor, acknowledge, or take seriously the various kinds or faces of wisdom. I wonder what you would say in particular about how Baylor or Notre Dame might take seriously contemplative wisdom. Contemplative wisdom.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, in a sense, it's a good question, and I think that I sort of tried to address that in the previous answer a little bit. What I'm arguing for is a contemplative wisdom that, if you like, slows us down. I think that part of the problem in the society in which we're living is the need for technological fixes, which tends to take us away from what I will call the silence of being able to contemplate. I think we've lost the art of contemplation. And I think that Wendell Berry is a good example of someone who is able to do that. But contemplation can be about divine scripture, that's one way of contemplating. Contemplation can also be traditionally on the book of nature. And I think Bonaventure is a good example of someone who believed that the natural world can, if you like, give us insights into who God is. But at the same time, our life has to be rooted in prayer, as it were, if we're going to see what those insights are. Now, of course, much of this would only make sense within a Christian university. So I think the language of paying attention and the language of wonder makes sense amongst scientists as well. If you look at, and I've written a book on this, on wonder and wisdom, which is upstairs. One of the crucial issues for many scientists, or the motivation for many scientists, is the joy of discovery and the wonder that they experience in gaining insight into certain aspects of the natural world. And I would say that this is an echo of the kind of wonder that believers experience in relation to God, the awe that they experience in relation to God as creator. So I think that there are rooms for thinking about, well, what does wonder mean in this amongst scientists, and what does wonder mean in religious experience? But we can't expect scientists to adopt religious experience, but what we can do is to say in our conversations, well, you have a particular wonder about this area, maybe, I can find some common ground or common language within which to talk about this together. The difficulty, of course, is unless you're like Barbara McClintock, she was a geneticist who talked about what she called the feeling for the organism that's been talked about in a biography by Evelyn Fox Keller. And in this feeling for an organism, that, as it were, allowed her to gain insights about what was happening in genetics in a way that wasn't simply through rational analysis. But if you look at the way her experiments were reported, and eventually she got a Nobel Prize in medicine, there's nothing of this feeling for the organism in there in the experiments. And I think that sometimes those who aren't scientists read scientific experimentation and they come away with a very dull feeling of this is all so rational and logical and systematic. What they don't understand is the psychological and the emotional processes that go on to arrive at some of these discoveries. And I think it's that where we can start keying in or finding some analogy with religious experience. I don't think it's the same. I don't think it's exactly the same, but I think there's an analogy there which may be useful in building up conversations.